Chapter 11, The Spitting Preacher. Years ago, on a hot Sunday morning in a little country church, I performed a 20-minute concert before the pastor got up to speak. I took a seat on the front row where I normally sit when I am a special guest in a church. The front row is a great place to observe body language, facial expressions, and hair transplants. I noticed, however, that everybody else was sitting in the back. But it was a Baptist church, so I didn't think much about it. In this little church, the front row was just a few feet away from the pulpit. From where I was sitting, I could count the lines in the pastor's forehead. It wasn't bad when he started, and I was really enjoying his sermon. He could really preach, but I didn't hear him finish because he did something that distracted me. The pastor was preaching on Yeshua HaMashiach, Hebrew for Jesus the Messiah, but he had a little trouble saying it. I think he had hyperactive spit glands because the more excited he became, the harder they worked. In the middle of his sermon, he raised his Bible in the air, slammed his fist down on the pulpit, and sprayed Yeshua HaMashiach is the Lord. It looked as if Niagara Falls had broken loose. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was spitting all over the place. I felt like I was riding a pew through a car wash. It's a wonder he didn't electrocute himself with that much water hitting the microphone. Every time he opened his mouth, he showered another section of the congregation. He was an equal opportunity spitter, and the louder he preached, the thicker the mist. I wanted to look away. His cascading saliva was making me feel nauseous, but I couldn't. I knew if he should happen to look at me and see me looking as if I weren't paying attention, he might not give me a good love offering. And then I wouldn't be able to eat and buy gas so I could get to the next town and sing for another spitting preacher. So I continued to look at him. He was drooling like a rabid dog, frothing at the mouth like that demon-possessed man Jesus healed in the graveyard. The room started spinning, and I realized that I had to get out of there, but he'd only said in closing twice, so I knew we had 20 more minutes. I started repeating over and over to myself, stare at his forehead, don't look at his mouth, stare at his forehead, don't look at his mouth. But you know me, I never listen. My eyes were drawn to the saliva puddling around his tongue, splashing over his bottom lip. Every time his lips separated, little strings as thin as fishing line would stretch, snap, and land somewhere on the pulpit. On some syllables, he actually blew bubbles. Why did I forget my umbrella again? At this point, I'd forgotten what he was preaching about, but he hadn't. Through the flying confetti, I could see his hands flailing and hear his voice rising. The sermon had gone on so long, I wondered if he'd ever run out of spit. How much of that stuff can a body produce in an hour? I tried to get my mind off the falling saliva and onto what he was saying. But then I noticed a change. The air seemed to be clearing. The floating particles were landing, and fortunately none on me. His hyperactive spit glands had finally been depleted, and all was well. Except now his tongue was dry, and he was having trouble pronouncing his S's. By the time he said, "Shall we stand and sing a song of salvation, saints?" I could barely understand him. At the end of the service, the pastor took me to lunch. He handed me a check and asked me what I thought of his sermon and if I had any advice for him. I said, "I only have one word of advice, and I don't know if you'll get it." "Try me," he said. I said, "Okay, here's my advice. Swallow."